Good morning, everyone. Well, Ipsos is a global market research organisation. We seek to understand markets, society and people. And our latest global research points to a world that's almost universally concerned about inflation and rising energy costs. And I think this played out in the research we've just done with people living in Sydney this year. So I think quite fittingly, our next panel is around economic resilience, which will be led by Professor Roy Green. And the panel will be looking at ideas around how we develop a more equitable city. So handing over to you, Roy. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, and it's great to be here. We're going to talk about economic resilience, and there wouldn't be too many people in this room that haven't either read Jim Chalmers' essay on capitalism after the crises or have read something about it, including the various controversies that swirl around that essay. One thing that hasn't really been focused on, however, which Jim Chalmers makes quite a lot of, is the issue of vulnerability. And that's an issue that arose in the context of the three crises that Australia has experienced in the last 10 years. The global financial crisis, of course, the pandemic, and most recently, of course, the disruption to supply chains and also the associated inflationary upsurge. But a longer-term issue that underlies all of these crises as well, a more structural issue facing Australia, is the experience of low productivity, a productivity slowdown, wage stagnation and increasing income inequality, and underpinning all of this, the ongoing and increasingly intensified climate crisis. Adam Tooze, the economic historian and Financial Times commentator, refers to this as a polycrisis because there are so many different interdependent elements of this crisis. It's very difficult to identify which of them to focus on, but they're all important. And they've made all countries in the world vulnerable. Nowhere more so, perhaps, even though we're a very prosperous country and we've seen employment growth over the last couple of years ahead of most of the rest of the OECD. Perhaps the most vulnerable, the most precarious economy remains our own. And that's for a very important reason, that we have a narrow trade and industrial structure, a structure that's based on the export of unprocessed raw materials. It's the issue that is very difficult for policymakers to address because it's so fundamental. We talk about fiscal policy, we talk about monetary policy, labour market policy. It's very difficult to address the massive changes that might be required in our underlying industrial structure. We're effectively supporting a developed world lifestyle here with an emerging economy industrial structure, with manufacturing hollowed out, now down to 6% of GDP, $180 billion trade deficit, doubled over the last 20 years. And we've slipped down the world complexity rankings. I don't know if everyone is familiar with the Harvard Atlas of Economic Complexity. It measures the diversity and research intensity of our exports. Now, we're not at the bottom of the OECD, we're at the bottom of the world. We're number 91. We were in the 50s, in the 1990s, we've now slipped down to number 91, just ahead of Namibia, which is a pretty confronting thought. Especially for a sophisticated economy like ours. And the only way really to address this is by investing in our research and our innovation and our technological development in order to diversify our export mix. But what we've seen over the last 10 years or so is a decline in investment in our R&D. We're now at 1.79% of GDP. OECD average is about 2.5%, and a lot of countries are seeing their way out of the crisis and their reconstruction plans being based and really centered around investment in research and innovation. So Korea, Israel, Germany, Switzerland, countries which are more complex than ours and which recognize that they need to add value to their talent and their resources, are around 4 and 5% of GDP. We've seen a lot of very ambitious industry policies emerging around the world in relation to this, especially most recently the Biden administration's CHIPS and Science Act. So those are the challenges that we face, and we're facing them here in Sydney, we're facing them in New South Wales. We do have an interest, therefore, in investing in our knowledge assets. A Committee for Sydney paper that was published in the middle of COVID, so you may have missed it, was right on point with this. The Committee for Sydney's report on the innovation economy, unleashing the innovation economy, with some very significant recommendations to New South Wales and federal governments, and a focus on the growth of our innovation precincts in New South Wales, which offer a pointer, at least, to our future. But today we're going to hear from 3 experts in interrelated areas to comment on the challenges that we face. And we'll be asking the question, how do we achieve a more competitive and dynamic economy in Australia? How do we achieve a more inclusive economy, a fairer economy, not just in terms of income, but in terms of the distribution of our assets, including housing? And of course, how do we do energy transition? How do we make our economy more sustainable? And so we have with us 3 experts in this area. Firstly, Professor Greg Kaplan, who is a professor of economics at the University of Chicago. You'll hear he came from this part of the world, but he's based in the US now. His research spans macroeconomics, labor economics, and applied microeconomics, with a focus on the distributional consequences of economic policies and economic forces. In 2021, he co-founded E61, a not-for-profit economic research institute to bring together problem solvers from academia, industry, and government to tackle the big problems facing Australia. We also have with us Eliza Owen, who's a principal researcher at CoreLogic, and Eliza has a wealth of experience in property data analysis and reporting. She worked as an economist at Residex, research analyst at Domain Group, and previously as the commercial real estate and construction analyst at CoreLogic. She specializes in descriptive and inferential data analysis, data visualization, and framing data trends with broader economic concepts. And finally, Francoise from Endeavour Energy as Chief Financial Officer. Francoise joined Endeavour Energy in 2020 and plays a pivotal role in transforming the company's financial operations, regulatory protocols, and culture as it evolves from a traditional poles and wires electricity distribution network to a modern grid. And Endeavour Energy powers 2.6 million people living and working in Sydney's Greater West, Blue Mountains, Southern Highlands, Illawarra, and the south coast of New South Wales. And I'm going to start with Francoise and ask you, what is the capacity that we have, especially in our evolving industrial structure and the precarious nature of it, as I indicated earlier, what capacity do we have for energy transition in Australia, and where do we put our efforts? For example, it's said we could even become a renewable energy superpower if we put our mind to it.
Thank you, Roy. Obviously, as I said, same thing, we know that Australians are currently suffering under the very high price of energy and, generally speaking, the cost of living pressure. So the vulnerability that you talked about, for me, needs to be addressed on a few fold. The first one is our high dependence on the fossil fuel as a nation and as industrial capabilities. The second aspect is really that our inequity amongst our people. We know that there's a lot of home and rental property that have been built on the premises of abundance of fossil fuels, and they are facing the prime impact of the increased price of energy. Then there is the businesses whose operating model were again designed when it was relatively cheap energy costs. Finally, I think our regulatory framework is a little bit outdated. It was set in the 20 years ago and probably needs to be changed now to adapt to the volatility and the agility that we need to have to transition to renewable energy. And I would like to address also the investors' baseline, because we need to protect those very strong investors. We need a lot of funds to fuel this transition. So those are the vulnerability aspects that we need to address. In the context of climate change, we know that we've seen an increased frequency and severity of events. I mean, Endeavour Energy Francoise were massively impacted in 2020 with the bushfires, but also in 2022 with floods that were labeled one in the 100 years event, and we had 4 of them in 1 year. And our customer base, I think at large, the community is really willing to transition, and they want to do they want to act. They want to really be in control of the transition. They want to decarbonize their footprint. So with all of those, I think, different drivers, how does Australia stand up? Do we have the capability to become a super nation around renewable energy? Absolutely, yes. What we need to, I think, few ideas that I have to make sure we can accelerate and set up this transition on a good rail. We need, obviously, strong actors around the energy sector, so including the distributors, such as Endeavour Energy. We have the capabilities, we have the know-how, and we have, I think, the challenge to really create the smart grid. We also need to attract good and quality investors that are going to help us fund this transition. And we need to enable our customers to make the right choices, being the new technology, the PVs, that's the solar panel, and then the transition to electric vehicles, but also ensuring that the grid can have a two-way flow, which is quite dynamic and very different to the way that we have set up our electrical network so far. And finally, we need to have quite a solid and robust targeted reforms at state and federal level. And to do that, we need to really look at the longer term. We need to steer away from the short-term political decisions. It is a transition that is going to take decades. It cannot happen overnight. So I think, yes, absolutely, we are ready. But there's quite a few challenges, and we need to work in collaboration. So the regulator, the Australian Energy Regulator, has a game changer initiative, which is to bring together actors of the supply chain energy together and really to increase the collaboration. And I think that's one of the key aspects of success that we need to look into.
So I guess a question a lot of people would ask, given that in the longer term, of course, renewable energy together with storage is going to be cheaper and reliable. What about the transition itself, and when do you see the prospect of lower prices, cheaper energy costs in Australia, and do you have any thoughts on the policy levers that should bring that about?
So it will take some time to when the price will become cheaper through the renewable energy, because during the transition we are going to have to make some choices around the mix of the fuels. So transitioning from 100% fossil fuel to gas, and then to hydrogen, and then to the wind and the solar. And that really one of the key problem that we're trying to solve is how do we schedule the load required for residential, but more so for the industrial actors and electrolytes to generate hydrogen, but also the data center. So how do we match their load with the generator and the generation of electricity? That's the key question at this point of time, because we have production of electricity through renewable during the peak of the midday, but that's not necessarily when people are going to use it. So we don't have the right capability or capacity in terms of storage as yet. And I think the transition will be to make sure we match this load and the demand and the creation. So my views, and I don't have a crystal ball, it will take maybe a decade to get there, but it's not because it is complex and difficult and we won't see the results straight away that we should obviously stop. It's a longer term aspiration, it's a longer term goal, so we need to really, as I say, steer away from very short term decision and really plan for the longer term objective of the nation.
Right, thank you, Francoise. And by the way, if you have any questions, please use the Slido, and we'll endeavour to answer them towards the end of this session. But I'd now like to turn to you, Eliza, and let's talk about the housing market, and in particular, a source of increasing inequality, particularly in Sydney, with the strain on the rental market. How do you think we can address this as part of our overall transition to a more inclusive economy, and one in which everyone in a rich country like Australia has access to affordable housing?
Yeah, I mean, overall, Australia still has a pretty enviable home ownership rate at about 66%, which is above the OECD average, but that rate has been falling over time from an estimated peak of about 73% back in the 1960s. Now, that is a problem. That is a problem in Australia in particular, because there's aspects of wealth inequality that come with that disparity in home ownership, where we see reliably, despite different age cohorts, the biggest decline in the rate of home ownership has been among the lowest income quintile in Australia. And anyone who's tried to get into the housing market knows that whether it's by your parents going as a guarantor, or allowing you to live with them rent-free, or putting up equity to help you buy a home, it is much easier to get into the housing market if your parents already own something. So that's becoming a bigger determinant of whether or not you own. Deposit hurdles have ballooned, and in Sydney, CoreLogic estimates it takes about 14 years for the median income household to save up their 20% deposit. So those falling rates of home ownership are an issue. They're also an issue because housing has implicitly become more of the retirement system in Australia, whether it's housing equity withdrawal later in life, or aged care, healthcare costs, or simply being housing cost free by the time you're on a lower income in retirement. So that is an issue. But putting that to one side, I think the past few years have really highlighted the failure of the private rental market. The fact that throughout the 2010s, we had a lot of investment in the Sydney housing market. This created quite subdued growth in annual rents, averaging about 2.5% a year through the 2010s in Sydney. Over the past 3 years, house rents have now gone up 22% in Greater Sydney. Unit rents are up 26%, and this is only going to keep rising in the short term with the return of overseas migration. So that is a problem as well. And it's, if you like, potentially a more urgent problem because it cascades down to the most vulnerable in our society, where we've seen increasing need for access to specialist homelessness services. And in the 2020-21 financial year, there were 114,000 people seeking specialist homeless services nationally who were turned away. It's clear that the private rental market we have now has not been enough to cope with the extremities we've seen through the pandemic and fluctuations in population. So I'm not the, I perhaps don't have the experience or the expertise of my fellow panelists. In terms of solutions, I would probably lean on that 600-page productivity Commission report looking into the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, where an obvious win seems increasing Commonwealth rental assistance, if you like, to kind of triage our issues in the housing market at the moment. And looking to other parts of our taxation system, particularly in housing, that are quite inefficient. Obviously, there's some complications with the layers of funding and the structure of government funding. But for example, first homeowner grants, which we know to inflate property prices, are costing state and territory governments about $1 billion. So even peeling something like that back and putting the money into something that could be more efficient or helpful for those who are in really vulnerable housing situations are important. I think peeling back the capital gains tax concessions for investment properties is another pretty obvious win in terms of saving tax revenue. So I guess that's where I see the housing landscape at the moment and a pretty urgent need, particularly in that rental space.
So Eliza, you mentioned a number of policy directions there. One that is on everyone's minds, especially with the New South Wales election, is the first home buyer choice swap of stamp duty for a property tax. Do you see that as being effective? And if it's just confined to first home buyers, does that restrict its effectiveness?
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. The mainstream view on the benefit of swapping out a stamp duty for ongoing property tax is that you're incentivizing people being in the housing that they need at the time. So by only confining it to first home buyers, it's really not very effective. So some of the purported benefits, for example, would be encouraging empty nesters to downsize. I can see in my own life between my brother trying to buy a family home because he's got a baby and another one on the way. He's got my parents rattling around in a 4-bedroom home, his wife's parents rattling around, the two of them in a 4-bedroom home. Their housing situation makes no sense to me. And I think having a taxation system that starts to shake that up a bit is really important. But because this grant is only targeted at the first home buyer, it's just another first home buyer grant, a demand side incentive, if you like. I don't think it's going to be very effective. I do like that it's sort of encouraging owner occupation, and if you do try and treat the property as an investment later down the line, your property taxes are going to be much higher. But having said that, that might mean that the first home buyer just doesn't opt for the property tax in the first place. So, yeah, I think as watered down from this grand vision of stamp duty reform to the first home buyer choice, I don't think it's very effective.
So let's zoom out now to the macroeconomy with Greg. And I mentioned earlier that we're in a cycle of low productivity and wage stagnation with increasing income inequality. These are really tough economic questions. They weren't entirely answered in Jim Chalmers' essay, which was strong on philosophy but a bit light on policy. And I just wonder if, Greg, you've got some thoughts on that, and if you wish to make any comments also on the housing market and sustainability as well in that context, feel free to do so.
Thank you, Roy, and thank you, Eliza and Francoise for being on the panel. So we heard the Premier this morning talked about Sydney being a livable, workable, and beautiful city, and I think it's useful just to take a step back and put some of the housing price movements that we've seen in perspective. I grew up in Sydney, but I've lived in the United States for the last 20 years or so. And from an international perspective, the reality is that Sydney is a fantastic city and an amazing place to live by any standard, if not the most desirable city on the planet to live. And when you put it in that perspective, it's not surprising that house prices and property prices are where they are. What's surprising is that they were low for so long, not that they're high right now. Now, that raises some challenges, as we've discussed. And one challenge that we need to keep in mind is that Australia and Sydney in particular, and New South Wales, doesn't flip and transition to becoming a place where our comparative advantage is just that, a beautiful place to live. Roy, you mentioned the narrow industrial structure of Australia, the lack of complexity. We don't want that to slide to be one where what we have going for ourselves is our beauty. And we're going to see that, we can see that happening in various aspects of the microdata. One is in the increasing share of personal and household incomes that comes from passive incomes rather than active incomes, rents and capital gains as opposed to working in the labor market. So what can we do in order to raise our comparative advantage in other areas? Productivity growth in Australia has been slow, as it has in everywhere in the world. We tend to focus a lot on increasing the stock of talent through, and here education policies are important, in particular things like recent reforms to the curricula in New South Wales to kind of avert some of the slides that we've seen in test scores in New South Wales, and housing policies for the long term, which we'll talk about, play a big role there as well. But I think a big aspect that's often overlooked is about allocating our existing stock of talent more effectively and creating the environment in which to reverse some of the decline in market dynamism that we've seen over the last decade. In Australia, relative to where we were a decade ago, there's fewer firms entering the economy, there's fewer firms exiting the economy. Businesses are older than they were in the past. Market leaders are more likely to be the same market leaders as they were in the past. This is happening at every level of firm size. In Australia, an easy way to see that is to look at the biggest companies in Australia by market cap, 5 banks and a couple of resource energy companies. There's only one company in there that's new. Compare that to the biggest European markets and the US market in particular, where there's massive changes at the top. That dynamic has implications for all of us. What we've seen is a decoupling of individual wages and labor market outcomes from firm performance. Those industries where individual wages have become most decoupled from firm performance are those where there's been a decline in competition, where there's been this reduction in firm entry. And that slide away from competitive wage pressures and the move towards passive incomes driven by a perception that earning incomes and accumulating wealth by succeeding in making smart property choices rather than investing in human capital and contributing to the aggregate production of our economy. I think these are challenges that we're going to need to face going forward. In a way, it's really a symptom of our own success as a country, and so this is something for the long term to think of, to avert this sort of slide into apathy from a productivity perspective.
Great. And you mentioned the long term, Greg, and we have a question about that from the audience, and it's a good one for an economist because it's looking into the future, and maybe in 10 years' time no one will check whether the answer that you gave was the correct one. But the question is, what industries do you see driving our economy in 10 years, and what infrastructure, both physical and social, do we need to support these emerging sectors?
As an economist, I'm always loath to predict next week, let alone 10 years from now. On the industry question, I think the question is less about trying to pick winners right now and trying to predict the future. I think it's more about having a little bit of hubris and realizing that we can't predict, but let's not put the impediments up there to prevent the market from pushing us in those directions where we need to be. We need to create the environment that those industries will emerge, that vested interests don't place undue pressures on on preventing those new companies from emerging and growing, rather than right now trying to predict where it is that where it is that will be the sources of income gains in the future. I mean, if any of us were to look back as to when we were kids, it's almost impossible to predict. Would have been almost impossible to predict right now where the highest values would be. I mean, I think the only one that's a sure thing is invest in real estate. Everything else in terms of skills is completely different. So I think we have to be open and honest that we can't predict that. But in terms of investing in infrastructure and transport, there's a lot we can do. And I think it'd be good to have a discussion around the role of geography and where where in New South Wales we invest for the future in terms of infrastructure investment, moving beyond Sydney as a way of widening our productive capabilities, loosening some of those strains on housing supply in Sydney, given that housing demand is not going to be what brings down prices.
So that brings us back to Francoise, really, on the issue of infrastructure. Ali Abbas from the University of Sydney asks you, can you describe in more detail the challenge to bring all the energy supply chain actors together? That will be a big part of where future industry is likely to be directed.
Definitely, and just to bounce back and build up on what Greg just said, I truly believe that, agility is the key as well. So not really picking a sector necessarily that is going to drive economy and growth, but really realizing that we need diverse, obviously, industry skill sets and experiences to come together to solve our problems right now. So one of the problems that we're trying to resolve is the energy supply chain, and one of the key complexities, the way that it had been organized in Australia. So it's been very well divided. You have the generator on one side that do only generation. You have the transmission company that does only the transmission, then the distributor that do only the distribution, and then the retailers. And that segmentation has been good for a while, but I think right now, as we are trying to build this very modern and complex grid with a two-flow energy, which is a game changer, really, because traditionally everything goes from the left to the right, but right now we have our consumers and customers that do produce energy from their solar panel, and they need to put that back into the grid. So in itself, it is a engineering challenge, and we cannot find the solution, I think, in a more traditional mindset or the way that we've approached the grid so far. So one of the complex challenges is how to really rethink everything, come with innovative way, be able to tap into talent that maybe are not in the current electricity or energy sector, and see how even non-adjacent skill set can come in and help us to solve that problem in a different way. It will go around how we are going to transform the network to be a software-based platform, really. So everything is going to be a bit like, I do draw the parallel between the telecommunication sector in Australia 20 years ago. It was only landline, so you had Telstra owning, fiber everywhere. And you looked, later where we are today, we all have a mobile phone. We don't really think about which tower we are connecting to. Everything is done in the background for us. So if we sort of project that into the energy sector, are we going to see, a similar module of contract that we can tap in that will suit, either the rental market because you're renter or short-term, travelers, and you can switch very easily. For that, you need to have everything digitized. You need a lot of investment, but it is a different mindset and different, I think, way to solve our problems. So I would suggest that we look into that.
Another question that's just come in which relates to that is nuclear energy part of a net zero future?
You ask a French person, so
given,
that's going to be interesting. So if I
given the emphasis in France.
Exactly, yeah. So if I take my half French passport, I will say nuclear in itself, it is a green energy. Obviously, we've seen in the various two accidents that it can be catastrophic, but in itself, it doesn't create any carbon, and it's pretty green. It is the greenest energy. Now, if I take my other half passport, the Australian passport, obviously, there is no industry such in Australia. It is a decision point for us as a country. Where do we want to go? As I talked about earlier, how are we going to maintain the demand, load, and the creation of electricity from a renewable front? Maybe the baseline can be produced by another type of stable and green energy, such as nuclear, but I'm not saying this is the only solution. I'm saying this is one of the options or alternative that if we really want to be if we really want to achieve this net zero in the next 10 to 20 years, then it is something that we need to put on the table and discuss and decide.
Fortunately, no one's going to ask you about submarines.
No, you could, but I won't respond.
Really good question here for Eliza on the rental market. Is the rental crisis a failure of the private rental market or a lack of government incentivised social housing?
Well, a lack of government incentivized social housing, I think, has been a result of more of a reliance of the dominance of the private rental market. So I think that the two are kind of linked in a way, but yes, there needs to be another segment providing a housing option outside of the private rental market. And that's what we see in the UK, for example, which has a lot more sort of social public housing. I'm seeing, and I feel like, we've talked a bit about the Jim Chalmers essay, and I've seen this creep into Labor policy over the past few years as well, is maybe more of an introduction of an institutional competitor, increased emergence of the build-to-rent sector as well. I'm kind of skeptical about that. I think you only need to look at something like superannuation to see that when you entrust corporations with such a big part of our future and our security, you get some really good providers and you get some really not so good providers as well. So in that sense, I think that increased social and affordable housing needs to be a expanding pillar of our housing system, alongside your institutions, alongside your private individual landlords. The point I would make, though, is that at the end of the day, the supply piece is inelastic, and we're facing so many issues in the development space at the moment. So I think the New South Wales government has got some good initiatives around helping local councils, for example, with getting through some of the development applications. To give you an idea, though, I was listening to someone talk from Camden Council the other day who said they had a team of just over 20 planners dealing with the approval and processing of over 10,000 dwellings for the region. So the supply side, while incredibly important, and there does need to be that expanding public provision, it's just not keeping up with the rental crisis that we have right now. And that's why I would defer to increase of Commonwealth rental assistance so that people can at least maintain the tenancies that they have. But yeah, it is a good point, definitely boosting supply and boosting government-supported supply.
In the last couple of minutes, I'll follow up on housing with Greg, because we've got a lot of questions actually about the role of tax reform in the context of housing supply, and whether we should go back to the discussion that occurred a few years ago around negative gearing and other changes that might be made to the tax system to make housing more affordable, especially in the ownership context. What are your thoughts on that, Greg, quite apart from the political challenges?
Look, we have to distinguish between economic policy and politics. There's very, very few economic policy issues where you get almost uniform agreement amongst economists, and abolishing negative gearing is it. But I think that's a question for the politics and how it would be managed than what makes for good policy. In terms of the questions about stamp duties versus land taxes and how that plays into housing, again, the big difference between taxing on mobility versus taxing on use, which is the difference between a stamp duty and a land tax, is that we don't want to make it more difficult for people to move, and that comes back to the same discussion of having a dynamic economy and creating a tax and incentive structure that allows for that dynamism. But do I think that those policies are, well, I think they're kind of good ideas. Are they going to change dramatically the pressure that we see on house prices and house rents across the entire distribution? I think not, because I think at the end of the day, it's the house prices and rents are high because housing demand is really high, because this is a fantastic place to live with limited amount of supply. And we have to think about the supply issues if we really want to move. If we really want to move on house prices, and that. And that means looking outside of Sydney, looking at the other pillars of Greater Sydney, which the Premier spoke about, and thinking about local council areas. So those policies are good ideas, and they are important in terms of equity issues, but in terms of moving house prices, I don't think anyone should think that they're going to have a massive dent in the sort of trends that we've been seeing in house prices.
All right, well, I think that brings us to a close, and I'd like everyone to join me in thanking our panel, Eliza, Francoise, and Greg, for some very insightful comments on our economy and society.
Thank you, Roy, Francoise, Eliza, and Greg, for what I thought was a very forthright discussion of some of the challenges facing our city and our economy, but also for bailing up some clear views on what the solutions might be, and also recognising that there are no silver bullets for a lot of these challenges.